Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And there, of course, you can also find the podcast that I do and all the other stuff, interviews and whatnot. So definitely go over and check that out. Well, today we are going to be joined in just about a half an hour, about 1:30 Pacific, 4:30 Eastern, by Matthew Russell Lee, who is the founder and editor of Inner City Press, which is an independent news outlet that primarily works at the UN. Matthew has been working at the UN for, I think, over a decade. I think since about 2005. He's been reporting from within the UN. He was he was the first, quote, blogger to ever be an accredited journalist at the United Nations. And he's covered a variety of different stories, including the lot on the peacekeeper rapes in Africa, war crimes in Sri Lanka, the ongoing war in Yemen that hopefully we'll be talking about. And he's also reported on widespread corruption within the UN. Particularly the bribery scandal involving the former president of the General Assembly, John Ashe, and Ng Lap Seng, who is a Chinese billionaire. And that name might be familiar to some of the listeners out there. Ng Lap Seng goes way back to the 90s and Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. So sometimes, from time to time you'll hear these, statements by people talking about how Bill Clinton was, funded by the Chinese. And that's basically, I think, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's what they're referring to is Ng Lap Seng, who gave a ton of money to the Clintons, and he's still involved. He's mentioned in the Panama Papers more recently. But he was involved in a very large bribery scandal. We're talking, untold millions of dollars and, possibly even much more. And Matthew covered a lot of this, and as we'll discuss with him in a little bit, because of this, he was actually evicted from the United Nations. And he's now, he still covers the UN. He's actually there right now listening to a Security Council debate, in air quotes. And he'll be joining us, as I said, in a little while. But, he's got minders that follow him around. Most of the other journalists at the UN, unsurprisingly, despise him for actually asking questions and things. But he's a really interesting guest. He's somebody that I wanted to have on the show for a while. He's just basically one of a handful of actual journalists. If you're not aware, the UN reporters that, for instance, the UN Correspondents Association, UNCA, which is a group that Matthew actually left, and he formed his own group called the Free United Nations Coalition for Access. But UNCA is, they're worse, I would say, we're even worse than, White House correspondents. This is beyond, there's really no point to any of the journalists at the UN. They are just stenographers. They won't even put a remote spin on things. At least some of the White House correspondents, they might put a slight, conservative or liberal spin on it. Not that that's any better, but the journalists at the UN are essentially there to make the UN, only report on the UN positively. They won't, even when there's a negative thing, sometimes they just simply won't really talk about it at all. And they're, they're not critical at all. The very close relationship with all of the UN spokespeople there. And as we'll get into, I think, with Matthew later, I think there's a little bit more going on with this cozy relationship. But as I said, we'll be joined by Matthew in a little while. But I just wanted to, well, first of all, I forgot to thank people last broadcast. I forgot to thank all of the people that have donated on PayPal recently. So thank you, Janice, Stan, and Glenn for donating to my PayPal account. And thank you, Glenn, for bearing with me while I fixed some issues. PayPal was being a real pain in the ass, and I had to fix it. But thank you all so much. And again, if anyone wants to give me just a one-time donation, feel free on PayPal, of course. And I also wanted to say thank you for the great response that I got on the last week's episode talking about Jeffrey Epstein and the police video, and of course our great guest Jose Lambia. I was quite myself disappointed with my performance on that episode, but that just goes to show that most of the time when you're recording something, you really have no idea if it's bad or if it's good. A lot, and that the general rule of thumb is when you think an episode is terrible, or that you just weren't, you weren't there, or you thought you were kind of all over the place, you weren't staying on message or whatever that you wanted to do, is actually a great episode. And then the episodes that you really, pine over and work hard and you think are great, everybody dislikes. So thank you so much, because I was a little disappointed. I don't know what, I think it was the heat, as I said in that episode, we were in the middle of a heat wave here. My shirt was see-through. I was sweating so much. It is still rather hot here in New York, but thankfully it's not so bad. But yeah, thank you so much for the response. It was really great, really positive. Got a lot of people that are still interested in the Jeffrey Epstein case, and that's great to know. And it was crazy that, again, all it took was just him calling up. So we're definitely going to try and get this Trump deposition that he gave, because I think that'll be really interesting. And we didn't get to talk about it last week, but the Trump deposition has been referenced before in an article that Ken Silverstein wrote, I want to say for Vice, of all places. And Ken Silverstein talked about the deposition, and he actually interviewed Brad Edwards, who was one of the lawyers representing some of the Jane Doe victims, the two main ones that have come forward. And according to Brad Edwards, Trump was actually quite complimentary. He's very he was one of the only cooperative witnesses that they got for a deposition. I linked up in the show notes to that some excerpts from various depositions, and with the exception of Epstein's pilot, and I believe some of his one of his butlers or whatever, he's also gives some information in the deposition. But other than that, almost all those depositions, Epstein. There's a deposition by Nadia Marchenkova, who's one of the procurers, and is possibly the girl that Epstein actually bought in the Balkans. They basically, they're essentially there with Epstein's lawyers, and they plead the fifth on everything. But apparently Trump was one of the few people that was actually very forthright. Now, who knows what that means? Maybe he wants to. I assume he probably wanted to save his own skin. He wanted to maybe have that in his back pocket. So if it ever does come out, or if somebody, reporter out there wants to talk about it on the election, he can say, "Oh well, I gave all the information. I was, I hated Epstein. It's all Clinton." So it'd be very curious to see what is it actually in that deposition, what he says, and I don't think it's going to be all that difficult to get. I think we just really need to ask. But I'm going to work with Jose down in Palm Beach and see if he can't get his hands on that. Maybe send it over this way. Maybe hopefully we'll have him back on and we could discuss that. But thank you all so much for the positive response on that. It is I know that sounds very I don't know, like silly or childish, but it is great to hear some positivity. There's a lot of negativity, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, in the alternative media. Most of it is negative, especially on YouTube. So it's great. It's great to hear that. And just as I'm speaking right now, I just got a comment on that video on YouTube, and it is saying that the Conchita Sarnoff book is actually out, Trafficking. So we'll definitely have to get our hands on that and read through that. I'm sure there will be some interesting stuff in there. And apparently I'm getting a link to her a different website. Or no, maybe this is her same website. This is ConchitaSarnoff.com. So very interesting. Can't wait to see what's actually in there, what she does talk about, what she doesn't talk about. And definitely we're going to follow up on that, because I only barely kind of touched on the Conchita Sarnoff stuff at the end. But there's a much larger story there that I don't even think we've scratched the surface of. And of course there is also another book coming out, which is again being labeled as the great expose that's going to change the election. And this I mentioned it, I think, in the last episode. This is by John Patterson, who's a cheesy kind of airplane novelist who writes a lot of courtroom drama type things. A good book to read on the beach this summer perhaps. But no, not his Epstein book, but his fiction books. But he's co-writing that with John Connolly, who is a very mysterious bizarre character connected to everybody, but most famously is a paid agent of Scientology. And there are some other connections as well with Connolly is now editor of Vanity Fair, which of course spiked Vicky Ward's original story on Epstein, where she had a couple of young girls, and their mothers, who were willing to go on record talking about Epstein, talking about how he had touched them and propositioned them. And of course, and Vicky Ward is someone who Conchita Sarnoff does not like, which is interesting in and of itself. But anyway, enough on that. I think we'll definitely be returning to the Epstein story. But as I said, Matthew Russell Lee of Inner City Press, he will be joining us in about 15 minutes. But we've got a little bit of time right now, and I thought maybe we're going to be talking a lot about geopolitics with Matthew. And particularly at the UN. But I thought we could, because I kind of briefly mentioned it in the last episode, talking about Gulen. And I thought I could just kind of touch on this, because there's been some developments on the Turkish front as it relates to the coup, the attempted coup, took place a little while ago now, a month ago. And I thought I would just kind of touch on this, because I've been seeing a lot of weird stories floating around in the mainstream, in the alternative, and I just wanted to comment on it, just because I know that some other people have called me out for criticizing the way that some of this stuff is being reported. And there's a lot of this doom and gloom, and it's World War III is about to take place, and Turkey is going to leave NATO and join up with Russia, and they're going to defeat the New World Order and take down NATO. And I think this is all a big show for us. I don't think any of this is really true. And I just wanted to, kind of briefly touch on it, because this is a problem I see time and time again with geopolitics, the way it is actually being reported on, particularly in the alternative. Which is just mimicking the mainstream. But they latch on to these stories and these ideas. Because secretly, everybody wants, to have this white knight, this savior, this person that's going to defeat, as I said, the powers that be, the evil one. So many times this becomes Putin. Everything that Putin does is A-OK and wonderful. And now, oddly enough, it's becoming Erdogan, the CIA puppet who deeply involved in fostering and training and creating what is now ISIS, using Turkey as a training ground and a place for ISIS fighters to come and go. Ooh, excuse me. That's great. Burp on live radio. And suddenly now Erdogan he is wonderful. He is a good guy. He hates America. He's going to kick NATO out. And, I just want to say, with geopolitics, slow down. take a step back. Geopolitics is never as clear-cut as what these people are saying. And this is something that I find really fascinating because I think it affects both sides, the alternative and the mainstream, whatever those really represent anymore. But world leaders, particularly people like Putin, but also Erdogan, they don't just sort of come out and say it, That's something that I think is there's very little nuance when it comes to American politicians. Even when, Obama is lying to your face, it is quite, he is very straightforward. You can tell that's a lie. Like when he said, we don't torture, that's a lie. We're not, droning children in Pakistan. That's a lie. There's no real nuance when they're talking about things. Whereas if you listen to, say, Putin, when he gives these, yearly sort of Q&As essentially, where, open to the public. Obviously the questions are picked in advance. They're not going to, they throw in a few kind of, quote, difficult questions, but they're picked in advance. But nonetheless, I don't know, Obama doesn't do this. Now, when he answers those questions to a to a Western ear, they're very kind of like cryptic and bizarre. There's a lot to unpack in those. He's not coming out and just saying it like it is. They use a lot of metaphors. They use very sort of bizarre sentence structure and the way that they say these things. They're not just coming out and telling you exactly like it is. So when we see these reports or these proclamations from people like Erdogan talking about how Turkey is going to completely change and NATO we're going to kick them out, all these things. That's not necessarily to be taken at face value. Okay? The same way that there are things that are coming out from what we can only assume are Western sources, that should also not be taken at face value. So, for instance, there is this ridiculous story that the first time I heard it, I didn't believe it, but there's a story that originated from Euractiv.com, which is basically it's like an EU outlet. It's an outlet that covers mostly, EU affairs and European affairs. And they said that they had, several high-ranking sources or whatever told them that the United States was moving its nuclear weapons out of Incirlik, which is an airbase, a NATO airbase in Turkey, which was definitely involved on some level with whatever was going on back during this failed coup. But they were saying that they're shipping these weapons out of Incirlik and sending them to Romania. And this was picked up by some, the sort of pseudo alternative outlets like Breitbart and some others, but also, obviously RT, Sputnik, the usual sort of sources, and other people as well. And that became a story. That became an accepted fact. Now, what wasn't accepted is the fact that the second that came out, Romania denied it. The U.S. military has nothing on this. They're not. They're mum on it, so we can interpret that however. But the Romanians said no way. There have been on and off protests in and around Incirlik by Turkish citizens. Now, if you're trying to transport, dozens of nuclear weapons, do you know what that takes? And nobody has said anything. There's not a picture. There's not a news report out of Turkey. There's nothing. It was just they're moving them to Romania. That's it. We're going to run with it. We're not going to do any checking. We're not going to try and source this. We're not going to try and figure this out. Nope, that's the story. We're sticking to it. World War III is on the horizon. Russia's going to move into Incirlik and they're going to defeat NATO. Now, Romania, first off, beyond denying it, they don't have the infrastructure or the capacity to actually house nuclear weapons there. So I don't know why they would do that. If America is so concerned about this growing relationship between Turkey and Russia, which again that's not how geopolitics works. Turkey and Russia have always been foes. They've always, Turkey has historically played the U.S. and Russia off one another. So, okay, things are a little, heated. Erdogan is not wild about America right now. Okay, he's going to cozy up to Russia. The same way, a few months ago, he was complaining, about the Russians and talking, I think it was in reference to the, Caspian Sea or something. You referred to it as a Russian lake. He had no problem, shooting down Russian pilots. Believe me, this is all for show. But anyway, again, that gets picked up. That's everybody runs with it because it fulfills their own wishes. They want this confrontation to happen. That's what's so funny. You hear all this, World War III is around the corner. This is really scary. This is serious stuff. This is what we should all be talking about. But they kind of want that. They like that idea. Again, confrontation. It's all about confrontation. Everything is about putting people into boxes now. And I see that all the time with the, comments on YouTube and whatnot. Well, what are you? You got to pick a side. Are you for Trump or are you for Hillary? I mean, I had people commenting on the Epstein video like that. But anyway, I believe I am being joined right now by Matthew Russell Lee. Matthew, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, excellent. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I was just sort of ranting about a bunch of things over there, but let's get to you. So as I said at the top of the hour, you are the founder of Inner City Press, which has covered the United Nations since 2006. But why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? Who is Matthew Russell Lee? What is Inner City Press?
Sure, it's been a long road. It's a publication. It's now it's online, innercitypress.com, but it's gone through various iterations. It began in the Bronx. We were fixing buildings that were abandoned. Have also done looking at banks not lending in poor neighborhoods. But since 2006, sort of by a series of flukes, I came to cover the United Nations, and I grew to like covering it. I mean, I'm angry by a lot of what I've seen here. But it suits me. There's always a lot of different stories going on, both kind of from sort of nitty-gritty corruption to bigger picture foreign policy things. So it's gone. I don't want to say it's gone smoothly, but they haven't. They threatened me a number of times. They in various ways. I was threatened at least 3 or 4 times to be somehow cast out from the UN. But I mean, I have there are definitely a lot of readers, and I get a lot of stories. So, but this year, this is the final year of the Ban Ki-moon era. It's been a 10-year. Secretaries General are elected for 5 years, but it's sort of an automatic second term. It's fallen on me like a ton of bricks. Basically, in February, I was ordered out of the building on 2 hours' notice. In April, from my longtime shared office, which I'll explain why it's important. It's not so much that I need an office, but I need access to the building. They took all my files and threw them out on First Avenue. So it's been quite a fight to get back. I'm actually inside the UN now, but if I go out of what's a really pretty small area around the Security Council, I'm required to have a minder and who stands right next to me as I speak to people. So it feels like I'm in another country. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the UN it's like its own little country. And you've got some excellent videos. Again, we'll link up to these in the show notes on YouTube. It's like Alice in Wonderland, the sort of the way that the UN works, the way that they treat you, and
it's really yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll explain it. I don't know how good they are, but they are. It's sort of suited. I've actually found that they give sometimes so few answers here that I'm using now Vine, which is a 6-second, looped video, because there's so many of them in which, I guess you can do something called Beyond the Vine, where you can have a longer thing behind it. But basically, ever since I came here, they have a noon briefing almost every day. Sometimes they go into hiatus, but pretty much every day. It's less, I've gone, whenever I'm down in D.C., I go to the State Department briefing, and it's kind of a backwater, to be honest. A lot of the questions, and this is, hopefully we'll have time if you want to hear about this, a lot of the coverage of the UN is really, it's pretty soft, because there are very few people. Basically, the big wire services will have somebody here, but it's basically to get like a single quote for a larger story. You know, like if you read a story about the Middle East, you'll have like paragraph 11 will be like Ban Ki-moon was deeply concerned. This is the sort of classic formulation, but the spokespeople here can use the doling out of that deeply concerned quote as a kind of as a Pied Piper to get people to stay in line. So most of the noon briefing is usually people saying like, what does the Secretary General think of X? And he always sounds good. He's always thinking the right thoughts. He's always deeply concerned about freedom of the press and calling for de-escalation and for more talks. Very little is accomplished. And I've come to see through it all that I'm not sure he's really thinking these thoughts, at least as applies to himself. So I try to when I first got here, I didn't have any sources. So I would literally use like Google News and just read the last 24 hours news and think, what would people that are not in the building and not allowed in the building, what would they want asked, you know? And sometimes it would be very nitty-gritty stuff. Like I remember one of the first things I started working on was a family's son was run over and killed by the UN in Liberia. And it was on a Liberian website, and they didn't get any. They had gone to the UN, and the UN said, we're immune. We don't have to give you anything. So I went to the noon briefing, and, after a lot of, what does Ban Ki-moon think about X, Y, and Z, I said, what's the UN going to do about this kid that they killed? And they said, well, we need time to study this. And afterwards, the spokesperson came to me in the hallway and said, that's not what this briefing is for. This briefing is for burning political questions. And I said, no, the Security Council is for, if I want to ask that, I go to the Security Council and there's a stakeout, and you have ambassadors, but like the UN at a bare minimum should be able to answer, and should have to answer for when it kills people. This is kind of my bottom line over here.
Well, and again, I think that's something that's really important that I have gotten so much out of in terms of the coverage that inner city press does, because as you said, of course, these big, Reuters, AFP, Voice of America, which we'll hopefully get to, all of this, the New York Times, all of these organizations, they have somebody at the UN, but as you said, they're basically there for like a handful of quotes. There's not like a UN section of a newspaper. There's no one that's really on the UN beat, on a sort of, like a micro level where they're actually looking into, okay, well, what about these rapes in Central African Republic?
Mm-hmm.
What about what's going on in Yemen? They're there, as you said, to basically, well, what does Ban Ki-moon think about, global warming or something? Oh, he's really concerned.
He has many thoughts on that. So I've heard, Although,
right.
Here's an inner city press classic I'll tell you about. Right after a briefing in which Ban Ki-moon's big thoughts on climate change were announced, I looked at one of the recycling garbage cans here, and although it had 3 holes, cans, plastic, metal, they all went to the same place.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I went and asked this, and they said, well, that has nothing to do with us. This is just our contractor. It was like classic. It was like, if somebody came to the UN and said, some clothing manufacturer is blaming its contractors, they'd say, oh, no, this is unacceptable. There must be accountability. And it's like, literally like 20 feet from the UN briefing room, there's fraudulent recycling. So, but I mean, the one thing I would say is that what I've sort of learned is initially, and then because I would ask these kind of questions, I started getting sources within kind of UN staff or the UN world. Now I have a lot of diplomats, but I still like the basic, the people out doing the work for the UN. I'm not by no means anti-UN. There are many good people. It's a kind of a roach motel for idealists in the sense that like people are drawn to it and they do mean well. And then they go out and oftentimes they find they're not allowed to do what they thought they were wanted to do, or they're told to shut up about things. So they'll send me things. But you can actually end up covering a number of foreign policy issues because you have kind of a unique, you have some unique sourcing in it in terms of, like, let's say the Yemen envoy, different things. So it's not always the fraudulent garbage can, but it often is that.
Yeah, no, and again, it's if you watch your videos on YouTube or your Vine account, yeah, it is mostly UN spokespeople. Basically, what's so funny is if you watch enough of these press interviews or these press conferences, these briefings, and first of all, it's all the all the same journalists asking these sort of softball questions. God forbid any of them actually ask something hard-hitting. But and then you ask a question about like a very specific thing. You're talking, on page this of this particular report, and you go through all it, and it basically, the spokespeople just look so pissed off that you're not there to just sort of ask a question about, can you just elaborate on how great the UN is again?
Yeah,
that seems to be the bottom line, and that seems to be very much what the like the UN Correspondents Association, UNCA, is all about. It's just, listen, we're here because it's a cushy job. Okay, you get to be in New York, you get to go to the UN, you get to go to UN parties, you hobnob. You're not in a war zone or anything like that. And you can kind of do this and basically not really have to go deep on anything.
That's it's saying things just like that actually, it's part of my problem. Although now I'm sort of glad, this year's problem is literally directly with Ban Ki-moon. I've basically, we'll see if we have time to get into it, but I've concluded not just that Ban Ki-moon is inept, but that he's created a culture of corruption. And I know people, to the different side of the spectrum, but particularly the right, are always like kind of reflexively, the UN is corrupt. I don't know if I think that. I do know that, having been here this period of time, and I'll just actually to get it out of the sort of vagaries. I mean, here's an example. Ban Ki-moon named one of his mentor, a former prime minister of South Korea called Han Sang-soo, who was president of the General Assembly about 11 years ago, and Ban Ki-moon was his chief of staff then. And then he was groomed for this position. He's been waiting to have these deep thoughts all his life. He gave this guy a job as UN, it sounds like nothing, UN Special Envoy on Water and Disaster Risk Reduction. But it's a job. It's a UN job. You get a blue passport. You have immunity. And here's what he's been allowed to do with it. He's at the same time on the board of directors of a South Korean firm called Doosan, which not only does some business with the UN, but sort of more sinisterly sells water desalinization equipment, very big and expensive and probably well-made equipment, to the same countries that Han Sang-soo is giving speeches for as the UN water envoy. And it's the kind of thing that in the politics of many member states, it's a slam dunk. It's corrupt. It's a conflict of interest. It can't be allowed. Well, in the UN world, it can be allowed. And if you ask about it, the next thing you know, your files are found in the street. You know what I mean? And it seems like a fair question. He's also, this same Han Sang-soo character is on the board of Standard Chartered Bank, right, which is like a global bank. It's based in the UK, but it has a UN like brokerage contract. So it seems like this is pretty straightforward. You shouldn't be able to be an official of the UN and at the same time on the board of directors of the for-profit corporation doing business with the UN. Or if you are, and the press asks, there should be some kind of safeguard. They should say he doesn't participate in those meetings, or he doesn't take that part of his director fee. Nothing. They just say, let's move on. We're not here for that. We're here to talk about Ban Ki-moon's deep thoughts, about climate change or Syria, and they're just not that deep.
Yeah, of course, and it's funny too because and the UN would be the first to, if it's a Nigerian politician, like a corruption report in Nigeria, the UN is all over it. Oh God, these terrible, they're destroying the country. But obviously, when it's happening,
and they'll even say, here's the biggest irony. I've seen them say things like, we urge countries to respect the right of the media to cover corruption. I'm literally not kidding you. Whereas it's like, and to make it otherwise, this might seem like a cartoon. Like there is a nexus here. They didn't just come to me one day and say, we don't like your stories, we're throwing you in the street. It was a little more complicated, but I don't think it's that much more complicated. You may have, your listeners may have heard the UN was in the news, for corruption briefly last fall when a former president of the General Assembly, John Ashe from Antigua and Barbuda, and a Macau-based businessman, Ng Lap Seng, who was previously connected to the Clintons. That's why both of these names still kind of circulate on the periphery of the media, but they were indicted in a bribery scandal. And it's pretty well documented. It's not, Ng Lap Seng is saying it was political because he's Chinese and it's some attempt by the U.S. to, reign in China, but it's a pretty well documented case. And having been here, it's all credible to me. Basically, people are buying access all the time. These guys just got caught.
Well, no. Let's. I was mentioning that at the beginning of the broadcast, Matthew. So let's get into that because again, I remember Again, however briefly, but I do remember, it was a story. I mean, it took place in New York, so it was a story here.
It's still a story in a way. If you check the news, you'll see that especially the big media that have people play based down in the Southern District Courthouse. Well, there's been about a story a month about either a new transcript filing, or a new plea bargain, or a new and many of those I can cover just through Pacer. Some of them you have to be inside the courthouse to actually see the transcript, and it's taken a kind of a Chinese spying angle. But the UN side is very much alive, except that they're doing everything they can to sort of try to stamp it out. So you tell me how you want to proceed. I'm more than willing to, because this is actually when I think to it, I've been asking kind of questions they didn't like ever since I've been here. But I can't help escaping that it's this case. When I started asking about the way in which that case, was connected to the Secretary General, to the head of the Department of Public Information here, and even to the Correspondents Association, this is when, the hammer was dropped.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say, is that I think, as you said, you were always asking tough questions. And I think, the stuff about Yemen, particularly these rapes going on, basically all over Africa at the hands of UN peacekeepers, or at least, looking the other way many of the time. Those are, I mean, it's sad to say, but that's almost sort of expected.
Yeah, they're used to those stories. And and people pick up on them, and it's always just a few bad apples. It's when you start connecting it to the 38th floor, they're very uncomfortable with that. But in this case, it does. In this case, it is connected, and I'll say I'll say how. Basically, they tried to say the way it's sort of sketched out is that this Macau-based billionaire, Ng Lap Seng, wanted to sort of take advantage of the UN and build a convention center in Macau, and in order to get sort of what looked like permissions or approvals, he paid the then president of the General Assembly, John Ashe, to spread money around in the UN, including to Ban Ki-moon's, high officials, to get the paperwork. And I don't think anyone disputes that. The question is is that as far as it goes? And it doesn't seem to be, because basically, number one, the Ng Lap Seng didn't just use the John Ashe. He had something called South News, which it's a media organization, but it has no visible means of support, and yet it has an entire floor of an office building near the UN. So that was kind of a telltale sign. And then there was something called the Global Sustainability Foundation. There were various entities, and these are all named in a UN audit, so I'm not making the names up. But here was one thing that sort of clattered in my mind. One of the entities that's named in the audit, and it was entirely funded by Ng Lap Seng, was called the Global Sustainability Foundation. And its founding was held inside the UN in the delegates' dining room, which is on the 4th floor. It looks out over Queens. You've got waiters going around with kind of generic, canapes. But Ban Ki-moon's wife and Ban Ki-moon's close personal advisor called Vijay Nambiar, former ambassador of India, were both present at the founding of this group. So there's a problem. This is not a group that sort of elbowed its way in off the street. They were right there from the beginning. They don't like this. Okay, forget the spouse. Then I attended one of these UNCA events. Because of the South-South News connection, they bought a table and they paid for pages in the program of this UNCA ball that they have every December. And in exchange for that, or in connection with that, I guess that's the big dispute, this Ng Lap Seng got photographs with Ban Ki-moon. So I keep asking about this. I said, well, what was the quid pro quo? They say, well, photographs don't imply any kind of approval, and da-da-da-da. If you were there, maybe you condoned it. That's one of the YouTube classics where it's turning it around, and it's and so finally, this is where I'll connect my travails to this thing. In January, there was a meeting of this again, and I say it without I'm being not cautious. It's moved beyond this UN Correspondents Association, but I saw it announced that they were going to have an event inside the UN press briefing room, a Friday, I think it was the 29th of January at 5 o'clock. And it was inside the briefing room where I go every day to be, I do get manhandled in there, but usually not physically. So I went to cover it, and it didn't say it was closed. And I knew there'd be some tension, so I set up in a booth, and I said, I'm going to cover it. If you can show me it's closed, I'll leave, but basically, this room is public. You have your own clubhouse. If you want to do it there, go and do it. They got the spokesman who said to me, just leave, do me the favor and leave and I'll explain it to you Monday. I said, look, I just want to see either paperwork or have a guard tell me you have some authority to tell me to leave the briefing room. The moment that's done, I'm out of here. Finally, one guard came and said the spokesman would like you to leave. I said, no problem. I went up to my then office. I put the video online. I wrote a story. I said it's an outrage, but I really didn't think much more about it. I've seen worse from the UN. 3 weeks later, I'm covering a meeting about Syria, and I get handed a letter. And I say, I'll look at it later. They said, open it now. I open it, and it says, you have to leave. You have by 5 o'clock today, turn in your keys, turn in your badge, you're done. I said, wait a second. This is about 3 weeks ago? You've never spoken to me once? There's no due process, no right to be heard? No, nothing at all. What they decided to do is to say I had secretly filmed a closed meeting. But number one, the meeting was never described as closed. And number two, I openly filmed it. In fact, I broadcast it live on Periscope, holding my phone in the air. But this is how it works at the UN. They were even asked by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, why did you do this? And they said there was an altercation. But the whole thing is on film. There's no altercation. There's just me saying, I'm a journalist in the briefing room. I'm more than willing to go if you show me a piece of paper or have somebody with authority, meaning a guard, not the spokesman's like, well, I told you to go. But I said, if I start leaving the briefing room when you tell me to go, you'll tell me to leave every day. I mean, right? So anyway, so it still struck me at the time that this could be somehow unraveled. Like it seemed so absurd and surreal, but they just kept going down the road. And so the reason they needed to throw all my stuff in the street is because now I'm a non-resident correspondent. What this means is I come in through the metal detector. Okay, no problem. I come a little bit earlier. A little indignity, no big deal. But the biggest problem is that my pass doesn't open turnstiles it used to open. And the only way to get through is to have a minder. So now I have a Ban Ki-moon minder as I investigate Ban Ki-moon corruption, which is probably just what they were aiming for.
Oh, exactly. And again, yeah, we'll link up to the video because it is just, and it's one of those, and you keep saying, well, why does this have to be private? Like what could you possibly be discussing,
right.
that is so hush. And they said, oh, well, you can join us and if you want to, and
for drinks. Join us for drinks. I've been looking back at the video and I'm like, I don't want to drink with you. It is a little bit surreal, and it's sort of, I'm in that room every day, and it's sort of, I'm not saying it's traumatic, but it gets so surreal here that I tried to come in. That was a Friday. The next Monday, I said, okay, I still have to do my job. So a friend of mine was going to sign me in. I was going to come at least, pending figuring out I would be signed in as a guest and do my work. I go there and they say, no, you've been banned from UN premises worldwide. This is for covering a meeting in the briefing room. So for 3 days I sat up in the park and diplomats brought me documents and I was in the rain and all, ultimately I could have kept it going. Maybe in fact it would have been reversed if I'd sort of done a hunger strike or something, but I'm a reporter. So I came back in, but then it gets more. So then I asked a few questions. I said, well, on what basis? And they said, no, you were never thrown out. You're here. I'm like, no, I'm using the past tense. I was thrown out. Now I'm back, and I'm asking you why. And they're like, no, you're here. You weren't thrown out. Next question. I'm just trying to give a little flavor of these.
Oh no, it's like it's like a Alice in Wonderland where they're reversing everything they say. Up is down, down is up, and it's this the absurdity to. And again, this is just typical of a massive bureaucracy, and I can't think of a bigger one than the UN. That's worldwide. So of course they're going to have these ridiculous, rules and statements and things like that. But kind of going back, and we're
sure.
coming up on the break, so we won't be able, we'll have to wait until for the next hour to really get into this. But again, as you were saying, I think this is really what kind of gets to the heart of the issue. So I think that as you were saying, that quote altercation was sort of maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. But a lot of this, I think, really does stem from the corruption. You can talk about, rapes and war crimes and covering up, the war in Yemen. And that's kind of that's what the UN does. But when you really start kind of poking and you start following the money, that's suddenly taboo. That's off topic. So I kind of want to just flesh out a little bit more the John Ashe story, because
sure.
I was telling you the other day, I was emailing you, the more I kind of started looking into it, and, I was reading the actual DOJ report and all this stuff, there seems to be a much larger story. But, I mean, one thing I just wanted you to kind of talk on briefly before the break is South News, that media outlet, that was run by, wasn't the former president was Frank Lorenzo, who also worked for the UN, correct?
Yeah, he was the Dominican Republic's deputy ambassador. But as there's a number of ambassadors here that apparently have other jobs or serving other masters. So yeah, and he was a known kind of player in the UN system. Like he had a D pass from the Dominican Republic, but he was at the same time spending most of his time on. And when you read the indictment, you'll see that what I saw was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of like he was literally like arranging trips to China, arranging like. I can deliver John Ashe to you, with a UN flag at such and such a time. So there's a lot of like, and it turns out there were ambassadors of other countries that were involved in that, and they ended up they went in August 2015. This is right before the indictment. They went and held a sort of like Alice in Wonderland UN meeting in Macau, where the Chinese businessman paid for everyone's travel, including some media, including UN officials. And they went and sat in a big hotel that he owned there with flags, but it wasn't a UN meeting at all. But there were so many UN hangers on with free iPads and hotel and travel paid that it had all the trappings of the UN. And it seemed kind of almost like a wasteful form of corruption. Because ultimately, all he wanted at the end of it was a resolution. Like you and I could pass a resolution right now. Why don't we just, I'm in the UN, let's call this a UN meeting. We can say like, wherefore, blah, blah, blah. He just wanted a piece of paper that would say there's a need for this conference center. And it seems like he probably could have just written it out himself, but, whatever. This is how it went. And one of the reasons I'm speaking with some, I'm following the case pretty closely, but most of the defendants have pled guilty, which, again, being cautious and lawyerly about it doesn't mean they did it, but when the vast majority of defendants in the case have pled guilty, something is going on, And the John Ashe, may he rest in peace. Again, this is again something that it's viewed as suspicious in some parts of the media, but first they said he had a heart attack, then they said he was lifting weights alone in his house and dropped the barbell on his neck. But to explain that, they say that he passed out twice in the last month alone in his house, which leaves me asking, then why was he alone in his house lifting a barbell over his head? But that's just me.
No, I was actually going to ask you, have you...
I don't know. It seems like, did the UN commit murder? They have done so in Haiti and elsewhere, but I don't know. All I can say is it doesn't surprise me that people find like crushed by his own barbell less than, like there's something there. But, you'd have to prove it, of course. Yeah.
Well, and of course, let's be realistic too. If John Ashe went down, I think a lot more heads would have rolled.
Oh, totally. They were everything. Yeah, exactly. I think especially now when I see the defense being put up by Ng Lap Seng, he doesn't know that much. He's I actually sort of heard I don't like to get into that, but yeah, he didn't know that much. He basically was probably throwing around a lot more money than he needed to get the photo ops that he got. He didn't, whereas John Ashe, and again, I went to his kind of eulogy in the General Assembly, and it's the strange thing here is that, the many of the developing countries, and I'm by no means like, they're all terrible and the Europeans are great, but they see this as sort of like an attack on, like, they thought he was pretty good. They thought he went to a lot of conferences. He was at one time the head of the Group of 77. He was the head of this, that, and the other thing. But he was a savvy player that definitely, like, he cashed out. That year as president of the General Assembly, he ended up with an indoor basketball court and a bunch of Rolexes and a timeshare. These things do happen, but it was weird to me that the eulogy was done without not just no specific reference, but without hardly any reference at all to that.
Yeah. Oh, and allegedly, we're talking about millions of dollars being funneled to John Ashe. I was just looking at the FBI agent who is quoted numerous times in that court document. He says, at one point, Ng Lap Seng flew into JFK on 2 different occasions with $300,000 in cash, once to New Jersey with almost 400,000, once to Anchorage with 500,000, and once again to Anchorage with $900,000 in cash. So, I mean, yeah, we're talking about and cash too. I mean, this is large sums of. I mean, I don't even know how you would carry that much cash. You know?
Well, you got to ask that the whole Iranian delivery, not to mix stories, but
yeah, no,
on a pallet, Pierce. You know, you would shrink wrap it, and no, I agree. They're in fairness to them, it's actually strange, and this is the kind of. I mean, I've gotten a lot of pushback because most people here have stopped asking about the case altogether, even though the case is still pending. But I'm following it, so I ask questions, and sometimes I get pushed back like from various people. Why are you not just UN people, but even the defendants? But now the defendants. Here's what's interesting. Ng Lap Seng has representation. Obviously, if at one time you had $900,000 in cash, you have some of it left to be paying your attorney's fees. He's not with legal aid, and these guys have made discovery requests to the UN. In part, it shows how little they've asked them for, like, all communications with South News. They've asked them for, all financing and financials of presidents of the General Assembly, going back to our friend Han Sung-soo, who I just mentioned to you, Ban Ki-moon's mentor, back 11 years ago. So it's kind of a broad sweep. But here's just typical of the UN. So they've made that request. It was a letter to the UN's head lawyer, a guy called Manuel de Serpa Soares, in July. I go to a noon briefing and say, okay, they've asked for these documents. Are you going to provide them? You said you would cooperate. Are you cooperating? And they said, well, we're going to be asking for guidance from the court how we should cooperate. So it's like, so you're not going to answer the letter. You're going to ask the court if you have to. And the reality is they're the UN, so they probably don't have to. So they're not going to. So all of the statements about we're going to cooperate in every way possible to get to the bottom of this outrageous misuse of the UN is a lie. Because they're not going to provide a single document to anyone.
Yeah, well, and I mean that seems to be their MO for most of this stuff. As I said, we're getting closer to the break, but I guess before we go to the break, and maybe we can expand on this a little bit in the next hour.
Sure.
But is there? When I was looking at this case and I was sort of trying to break it down, especially with this South News. And again, South News gave money to the UN Correspondents Association, and in exchange, UNCA gave them an award.
They didn't get an award. Again, in fairness, no one would say there's a connection. You'd think, like, it's probably a bad practice to, like, take money and then give an award, or give awards to your own board members, or, but again, they would say there's no connection, but I think the facts are the facts. The facts are they gave this money. These things occurred. And again, from my point of view, again, this is getting kind of self-serving. That's why I wanted to attend the meeting. I wanted to see whether they were going to talk, which I'm sure that I don't know if they would, but one way or another, I felt I had a right, if you do this meeting in a public briefing room, to see whether you've been contacted by the prosecutor, whether you're cleaning up your procedures in any way after finding out that, like, a member wasn't really a member. Like, what the Department of Justice is alleging is that South News was set up as a fraud. It was set up with $12 million from Ng Lap Seng. That it never really had I guess there's a lot of kind of vanity media, like, in the world, but that it really wasn't what it purported to be. If it's alleged that the Ng Lap Seng approach to the UN was one of bribery and corruption, this was certainly a part of it. And the irony here is, I don't mean it with any ill will to people that may have been scammed into working for South News, but check this out. Inner City Press was thrown into the street for a single attending a meeting that didn't say it was closed.
Oh, hold on, Matthew. We're coming up on the break, so
I hear it.
Yeah,
I can't say you didn't warn me.
We'll continue this in the second hour with my guest,
Matthew
Reveley.
No rules. No taboo topics. No fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Everybody, back to Porkins Policy Radio with me, your host, Pierce Redmond, and I am joined by Matthew Russell Lee of Inner City Press. And we were just before the break. Matthew and I were sort of getting into this kind of incestuous relationship between much of the media, or so-called media, and the United Nations, and on top of that, this very large-scale and still ongoing bribery scandal involving the former president of the GA, John Ashe, as well as Frank Lorenzo, who is a permanent member from the Dominican Republic, and of course Ng Lap Seng, this billionaire Chinese billionaire.
There you go.
And I kind of wanted to, Matthew, in sort of kind of switching up and sort of expanding this out a little bit, I wanted to sort of talk about this the way that I was looking at this bribery case, and we've got South News, which is getting all of this money from Ng Lap Seng. It's run by Frank Lorenzo. They're giving money to UNCA, these awards, and this sort of strange, again, this incestuous relationship, and in a place where if you follow Inner City Press, you can see that everything is kind of up for sale. But
pretty much
this sort of relationship, not that it's necessarily part of some, grander plot, but it creates a environment where that trickles down into, say, the coverage of events. Because, if we get away from just necessarily the bribery scandal and how that's being covered, I think that the sort of censorship and the collaboration between the United Nations and these media groups allows for cover-ups around the world, which are many times being perpetrated by the UN. Forget war crimes being done by, warlords in, Afghanistan or Congo or something like that. Just talking about the stuff that the UN is guilty of, and how that sort of. So I wanted to get your take on that, and perhaps we could talk about this incident that you've been following over at Inner City Press in South Sudan at the Terrain Apartments, which really brutal stuff. But I think it's a good example. So why don't you kind of get into that?
Okay, I will. And again, I'm going to do it in a sort of a first-person way, because this is actually the events at issue took place on July 11th in Juba, the capital of South Sudan. Although they've become only big news in about the last week, but on that day, July 11th, there had been in the previous 3 days a serious re-flare-up of fighting between the president and the still, on paper, first Vice President Riek Machar, that had a kind of a coalition government, but they never really implemented the peace deal. Their bodyguards started shooting at each other. And during this chaos, one day, on July 11th, so not that long ago, slightly more than a month ago, I was in the noon briefing for the regular circus that we've discussed, and I got a text message from somebody in South Sudan saying, "We're trapped in this building. We're trapped. Our people in uniform are outside." And so I just decided, it was one of these things where, I tried to Google the name before I raised my hand, and there really wasn't much time. I asked the spokesman, "What are you guys doing about that?" I called it Terrain, actually. I knew Terrain Apartments. And he said, I don't know. I don't know about these specific cases. We're always deeply concerned. After the briefing, I learned more, and it was horrendous. I still didn't know necessarily the scope. Just to get to the facts of the case is basically the army. It seems pretty clear, although everyone now is talking about doing investigation. The Salva Kiir majority army, largely of the Dinka group of South Sudan, broke into this compound very, very openly. It's that's why some people are saying it has echoes of Benghazi, in the sense that they were very openly. It wasn't an Islamist thing, but they were very openly saying, "Where are the Americans? Show me the Americans." They found a new error, which is the group of the former first vice president, or still first vice president Riek Machar, journalist called John Gatluak, and shot him in the head and killed him. They gang raped women, including international aid workers, the way it's being described. And for hours and hours, the UN never came to help them, even though all of the people were either working for the UN or affiliated through aid groups with the UN. Despite calls to a UN base very close by, no one came to help them. And this was so 2 days later, speaking more generally on the 13th of July, speaking generally about what had happened in South Sudan, the UN's envoy, the head of the UN mission there is a woman called Ellen Loy. She used to be the Danish ambassador to the UN. I knew her at that time. Now she got this job. She's a well-meaning person, but what she said when I asked her about the terrain apartments, and nobody else did, right? Everyone else was just like sort of, big picture or generic questions. I said, what do you know about the terrain apartments? And she said, I do know about that. We decided to call the government to go and help the people because it was easier for them to get there, which is a terrible answer because it's the government doing it. Maybe it's not Salva Kiir saying, go rape the aid workers, but it's definitely the army. And in fact, the animus behind it is it's basically his government feels like the U.S. And again, this is that the U.S. is being an imperialist. The U.S. helped form the country and now wants to dictate the terms. And he's a Dinka supremacist, whatever it is. So calling the government to go and save people from the government seemed absurd, right? They would not have done that in Sudan, for example, or in North Korea or in Syria. And then the UN shut up. They said, I asked them the next day, the spokesman, Stefan Dujarric, who's the lead spokesman of Ban Ki-moon, and he said, we're looking into our own role. Now, a month later, a guy, a very good journalist, who hats off to him, Jason Patankin, he's kind of a freelance stringer, but he's been in Sudan for a long time, did an excellent story for AP, in which he managed, having spent the whole month, to get on the record quotes of what happened. Now everyone is shocked. The UN says, oh my God, we didn't know anything. This is false. And I've been getting a lot of feedback because it's on film. They were asked about it. They answered questions about it. So to say they didn't know is totally false. But I have to say this. The U.S., Ambassador Samantha Power, put out a statement after the AP story saying it's especially troubling to learn that the UN didn't act. And I have to say, maybe she personally, I don't know what the defense could be, but I know for a fact that the U.S. knew about this. Because once people called the UN and got no action, they were calling the U.S. There were some Marines in Juba, believe it or not. There were also other Marines in Djibouti. And so, the full story of this has yet to be told in terms of why this delay. I was communicating with one of the people that lived in the terrain yesterday who believes honestly that like the UN and the US conspired to let this happen. I don't know if that's true. All I know is that a month after it happened, to suddenly say, oh my God, we didn't know, is false. And here's the real killer. I started getting feedback that people are being told not to talk to the press so I asked at a briefing, I said, is it the UN's policy that people who you abandoned and were victimized shouldn't talk about it? And they said, well, if something's under investigation, we don't want them to talk about it. So this is probably true beyond Ban Ki-moon's UN, but this is what I've been covering for this period of time. Basically, the purpose of the investigations is just to shut the story down, to say we can't answer because we're investigating it. Today, earlier today, they announced that this retired Dutch judge, Patrick Kamart, is going to do the investigation. Well, this same guy did an investigation of the UN's failure in Malakal in South Sudan earlier this year. No one's been held accountable. He did the same thing in Sri Lanka. No one was held accountable. So it's almost like, with all due respect to him, it's like the UN has a kind of, I'm calling it a cover-up cadre of guys that are in the orbit of the UN that can be brought in probably at pretty high salaries to do these independent, quote-unquote, investigations, to deliver a product that holds no one accountable, and watch, there'll be another scandal, and in a year's time, these same people will get the same jobs. Like, they know what to deliver. You could do better just opening the phone book and throwing a dart at it and choosing random people of any profession to do it.
Well, and again, this seems indicative of every horrific event or atrocity or crime that is committed either by the UN or with the UN sort of tacit approval, or I mean, like with the terrain apartments, at the very least, they knew what was going on and did nothing.
No, absolutely. What they've started to try to do is to blame, and this often is the case, is they've said, well, we asked the peacekeepers. And so the peacekeepers, when you say peacekeepers, they don't work directly for the UN. I mean, they are getting paid, but their government gets paid, and they get paid by their government. And they come in contingents. They don't serve, there's not like a UN army where it's like, hi, you're from Ghana, I'm from Azerbaijan. Let's go to the trenches together. They come in contingents, and they live in their own. I actually, before I fell out with the UN, I went on a couple of Security Council trips, where they go to these places. I've been in Darfur. We went to the UNIMID base. I met some Gambian peacekeepers who'd never left the base in 6 months. I met them the day before they were about to fly back to Gambia, and they were like, they never let us out once. Because although there's a mission there with almost 20,000 troops, the government doesn't want the mission to leave. And so these guys were like, they had weights, they were like flexing up, they had the air-conditioned trailers, they had RPGs, but they never used them. They flew in, and they flew out.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of, so basically what we've run into is in a few instances you have contingents that refuse to deploy. In the case of the Central African Republic, before the UN took over the peacekeeping mission, there was an African Union or a regional MISCA, peacekeeping troops from all the surrounding countries, Chad, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and all of these armies. I'm not at all. The French troops may have been the worst; they're accused of actual bestiality. But the neighboring countries' troops, some of them have their own human rights issues at home. I mean, I can talk about Burundi if you want. Burundi is accused right now of incipient genocide. Right? You have things are getting pretty tough. The army is they're abducting, members of the army from the Tutsi ethnic group. Meanwhile, the UN is using these guys as peacekeepers in Central African Republic. And then they're shocked when they find, suddenly there's a mass grave next to their contingent. Suddenly they're accused of, raping 12-year-old girls. And they're like, oh, my God, we had no idea. And beneath all of this, or not in every instance, UN peacekeeping has been run for 20 years in a row by France. And we can explain, France.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I want to get to that. I want to get to that in a minute.
Sure. Sorry, I was going off track.
Oh, no, of course. But I think that's another really important aspect to touch on. But again, I guess I just wanted to almost just make the comment that, I think, like you were saying, for a lot of people, and I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not really big on the UN. I do think that this is essentially par for the course. This is what they do is, basically enrich their own lives while oppressing other people. Obviously, there are instances where you can understand why yes, maybe famine relief, things like that. But there's so much politics with that. But what's so funny, and it's in a horrible way, is that it's like the Terrain Apartments is just one small little incident, but this happens on an almost daily basis at the UN, and it's all they do is just kind of brush it aside. And yep. It seems you really. This was so funny. People are always going on about the you got to get rid of the UN, corruption, but they never really talk about specifics. It's just like, we don't like the globalist New World Order. We must get rid of the UN, but without actually understanding. Really what the really nasty things that they're involved with, and the fact that when these atrocities happen, and as you almost always point out in these press briefings, it's this, Matthew, I don't want to talk about this right now.
Exactly.
Ask me.
We're trying to harvest facts. We'll get that. We think we've already answered that, or I'll ask the mission, or today they told me this is but it happened today. I was asking about, actually, as it turns out, I'm asking about the Ng Lap Seng case. I said, today is the International Day for the Remembrance of Transatlantic Slavery and its Abolition. It's a long name, but it's an important day. But here's what the UN did with that day. They allowed Ng Lap Seng, indicted, notorious, Macau-based businessman, to sponsor their slavery memorial. Yes, it's true. They did. It's in the audit. So I asked today, I said, in remembrance of transatlantic slavery and its abolition, just say, how much money did he pay? And the guy said, if you want to ask about that event, you need to ask the organizers. And then he said, no, I'll get back to you. So he cut off the question. But the reality is the organizers are all indicted. It's not a credible answer. Like, you know what I mean? I asked them the other day.
Well, and how did they not know?
They don't have, because they just, and the problem, this is where it's, I'm sort of frustrated. Like, I don't think I just ran into a diplomat on the way here. He's like, are they still screwing you? And I'm like, yes, they are. It's like, what, and I see him sort of looking down on me, like, if I was an effective diplomat, this wouldn't have happened, right? I would have, like, marshaled my forces and built a coalition, but that's not my view of what journalism is. In fact, I don't think you should have to do that. I think it's actually contrary. It's not to say that it has to be a kind of a Lone Ranger activity, but this is, and indulge me for a moment, like, when this thing happened, I thought it was so outrageous. The UN, which claims to be for free speech, literally, physically, they literally threw me out onto the street, threw my laptop on the ground, and 2 months later threw all my files out. I said, it has to be reversed. And I said, I really shouldn't have to, and I'm not going to, I don't think you should have to have a sponsor to be a journalist in the UN, right? You're supposed to, as much as possible, you should just be free breathing. But they were asked by a group called the Government Accountability Project, which is based in D.C. It's an American group. They defend whistleblowers. They're against fraud and abuse. They wrote to the mission, and they said, you've got to do something. And I will say this, nothing was done. Nothing. And so I personally, without getting into partisan politics, yes, under Bush and Bolton and these Republicans, they were attacking the UN no matter what it did, in a very generic way. Sometimes without the facts, sometimes with the facts, honestly, but often just sort of like black hell, But the current thing is worse because nobody holds the UN accountable. Basically, the countries that are here, everyone's just getting whatever they can out of it. There's very little interest. The powerful countries on the Security Council ultimately don't want to undermine the UN because the UN is what makes their veto powerful. Now, the U.S. is powerful outside of the UN, in a sense, but France and the UK, anything that makes it like the UN's a joke is not very good for them. Not just because they like the UN, but because, in a sense, their power is magnified by having a veto on the Security Council. So do they want to? Yeah. So what I mean?
No,
it's
absolutely.
The circle.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, maybe on that note, let's get into France's role within the UN, and particularly with this peacekeeping, because as you were saying, that is such a big deal, especially for. I mean, I think France and the UK. France has recently had this resurgence of wanting to rule Africa and the Middle East. They've become much more involved in. Obviously, they were involved in replacing what's his name? Laurent Gbagbo in Cote d'Ivoire, illegally, and then Mali and Libya, all these things. But let's talk a little bit about France in terms of the peacekeeping, because I think this is important. Because as we were saying earlier, it's par for the course. These horrific stories about UN peacekeepers raping, killing, doing, just bestiality, all these things, they happen from time to time. It's a blurb. Everyone is really shocked, and then everyone forgets it. But talk a little bit about the role that France plays with this, because I know you've referred in articles on Inner City Press that France, quote, owns
the UN. No, they do, actually. It's not. I don't think it's hyperbole. What happened was, at the time, this is going back before I covered the UN, but I've spoken to people that were there at the creation. When Kofi Annan was becoming Secretary General, France threatened to veto it. They said it had to be a francophone person. He didn't really speak French at that day, whatever. They said, we're going to veto it unless you give us DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And it was given to them. No one knew for how long, but they've controlled it ever since. And the U.S. Again, they're not the only ones. The U.S. currently controls the Department of Political Affairs, which writes all the deeply concerned statements about the Middle East. I think they basically just want to have that so that there's not a statement that they can't live with about the Middle East, for example.
Right.
The UK is they used to have political affairs and now they have humanitarian affairs. They're not all that happy with it. China has development. They're quite happy with it. Russia really doesn't have much. They have Geneva. They have the drugs agency. But France, this is a position where they've really used it. And they used it during the Cote d'Ivoire thing, where it would have looked bad to have this French. They had a force in Ivory Coast called Force Licorne, but it's literally like French soldiers in shorts and parachutes. It's a clearly kind of colonial force, I actually went on a Security Council trip before my travails with them to Chad, and it was surreal. There was a French base in the middle of the desert with these guys ready to play tennis, and it was too much. But so they used the peacekeepers to do it. But there's been the problem is They use it for contracting. I mean, I'll give you an example. Yes, France and its former colonial empire is having a lot of problems, right? So it's had to, quote unquote, intervene in Mali, in the Central African Republic, but they charged the UN for it. I got into a lot of trouble here for saying, is it the case that France, flew in and did airport improvements in northern Mali to fly its troops in to fight the jihadists, and then ended up turning around and charging the UN for it? And they were like, well, everyone does it. I was like, okay, maybe they do, but let's get into specifics. How much money are we talking? There's no clarity about that. There's no transparency. And especially since the department signing off on it is controlled by France. Now, since I've been here, there have been 3 in a row French heads of DPKO. The first guy was called Jean-Marie Guénaud. He's now the head of the International Crisis Group. He's a credible intellectual guy. Another guy was called Leroy. He's kind of a technician. He's now the head of some auditing group. The recent guy that they have, and this may be part of my problem here, is a guy called Herve Ladsous. I know for a fact and reported that 3 times in a row France tried to put him in the job and he was turned down. Like, the country owns the position, but the Secretary General usually gets to choose among 3 people. So France would put forward 3 people. Kofi Annan said, we're going to choose this guy, not that guy. What happened, and this was in 2011, they had chosen someone else from France to replace Leroy. But the guy started bragging about it. The guy was Bonenfant was his name. He was the French ambassador to India, and he started bragging in India that he was becoming the head of peacekeeping. And I was told this by diplomats in India, and someone gave me a copy of a congratulation card written to him before it was publicly announced. So I went to FedEx, I scanned the congratulations card, I put it online. It was a good story. Next thing you know, France says, screw it. The UN says, we don't want Bonenfant. He's too pushy. We don't want somebody that self-assured, that they're bragging about the job before they have it. France says, well, no more interviews. You're taking this guy, Ladsous. And they dumped him on the UN. So in his first press conference, I said to him, how does it feel? And he said, what I'm feeling is I'm not going to answer your questions, sir. And this is persistent to this day. He doesn't do anything anymore, so I can't put up videos. But I have a whole collection of videos of him saying, I do not answer you, sir. Like in a press conference. Like me saying, so what's peacekeeping's response to these allegations of rape in CAR? I do not answer you, sir. Last year, less than a year ago, this is the last press conference he's done. It's been a year. September 11th, 2015, he had to do one because all of these rape allegations came out about Central African Republic. I wasn't allowed a question. I literally was not physically restrained, but they just said, no, next question. I would say things and they just point at somebody else. But in the course of answering even softball questions about the rapes, he said, if the peacekeepers could just have some relatively cheap R&R flights, they wouldn't be raping so much. That's a quote. So it's the kind of thing that, usually a military figure is fired for saying that. Yeah. Not to be politically correct, but this is a firing offense. Only at the UN could you do it right in front of journalists and have people later say, well, he didn't really say that. It's like, here's the video. They're like, no, you've edited it. And it's like, no, This guy is incredible. He literally couldn't, and it's sad for the peacekeepers themselves because this is not to be politically correct. There are Chadian peacekeepers serving in Mali who are getting blown up by IEDs almost on a daily basis. They don't have the right equipment. Their government sends them out there. Here's the real I find this disgusting. There are now a few European countries that send peacekeepers. So, for example, the Dutch have been serving in Mali. Why did they choose Mali when it wasn't their colony? Well, because the UN had given them the top envoy job in Mali. There was a guy called Bert Koenders, who's now the Dutch foreign minister. But for a while, he was been in Ivory Coast, and he was in Mali. So the Dutch said, we're going to back up our guy. We're going to send in some troops. These troops had everything. These troops had night vision goggles. They had all kind of stuff. And the thing is, they didn't share this equipment with any of the other peacekeepers. Their excuse was, it's NATO equipment. They can only share it with other NATO members. So you have these 100 Dutch with super high tech, almost like video game gear, and then you have these Chadians with boots with holes in them getting blown to pieces by well equipped jihadists, and they call it the UN.
Yeah, no, I mean, just back on Ladsous' comment, he also says, Well, I think he says that the South Asian peacekeepers
exactly.
they fly him out for R&R all the time, and I mean it's almost is he saying they're flying out?
Yeah, say it now,
Yeah, and it's like then they're going to Brussels.
That's right.
Exactly.
No, it's incredible. It was an incredible, and ever since then they're like, well, what do you mean? And it's like. And just back on sort of the coverage front, I think one of the things about the UN, there is real corruption, but there's also just a general sense of like no one is held accountable. Like to me, it's like, okay, we're here. Not all officials are bad, but not all of them are good. Like ultimately, like in a normal place, people would like do a scorecard, right? They'd say like this envoy is doing a good job. Maybe he hasn't made peace in the country, but he does know both sides and he's viewed as a serious person. This other envoy never leaves their house. No one knows them. They're a joke. Even worse, let's cut to Yemen. The Yemen envoy of the UN, I have reported and will here repeat, runs businesses on the side. He runs a fishing business and he sells luxury vehicles to his native Mauritania. I have this on multiple sources and nobody cares. They don't care. The Yemen conflict is so surreal. It's so much a matter of like Saudi Arabia should be able to dominate its, poorer neighbor with these troublesome semi-Shia, that basically, that's the whole story. Like there was a huge rally in Sudan. Again, I'm not in the bag for Iran, but to try to make it that like the only people that don't like the Saudis in Yemen are pro-Iran is crazy. Saudi Arabia has been doing airstrikes on Yemen for like a year, killed 1,200 kids. So people don't like them anymore, if they ever liked them. But the UN is so craven that they allowed Saudi Arabia to choose the envoy. Saudi Arabia didn't like the last envoy. This envoy has spent most of his time in Riyadh, and it's like everybody knows it, but nobody. I mean, it's almost the P5. It's unfortunate because I think because Syria is both a bloodier, it's a higher profile conflict. They're just sort of phoning it in on Yemen, but the level of diplomacy has been pretty low. I ended up publishing the proposal the guy made in these talks that just broke down in Kuwait, and the proposal is a joke. The Houthis, like them or not, they control the capital. They basically control like a lot of the country. And his proposal to them was, you're going to give up your weapons, you're going to leave all the cities, and then we'll start talks. And it's like whatever you think, like this is obviously not going to work, It was like a setup for failure. And then he thought, well, okay, we're not going to let you fly back home because we're going to start bombing the airports. So it's really, but, again, my side of it, which other people don't pursue, is just this guy's running business. He's running business. So we'll go back to like really like mundane UN bureaucracy. Ban Ki-moon, when he came in, said he's for transparency. He encourages his officials to make public financial disclosure. Those who do, it's very vague. It says like, I own a house in Maryland. I have a mutual fund with Wells Fargo, right? It doesn't really get into much. But still, many UN officials refuse to make disclosure. Okay, in previous years, under Ban Ki-moon, there's been a master list on his website, which lists all UN Undersecretary Generals and Assistant Secretary Generals, and you click their name and you find out either that they own a house in Maryland or in Stockholm, or that I choose to maintain confidentiality. Suddenly in 2015, it only lists the officials who choose to report. The other ones are gone. So there's no way to know. So then I said, who made this decision? Who decided to make this transparency system, already weak, even less useful? And they said, well, they just refused to answer. I said, well, ultimately, I guess it's Ban Ki-moon. We can say, Ban Ki-moon, maybe he did it for his friend Han Sang-soo. Maybe he did it for this Ismail old Sheikh Ahmed, the Yemen envoy. But like anywhere else, it seems to me, it may sound dry, and thanks for letting me explain it, but it's not that complicated, right? When you intentionally help to conceal the names of the people who are not disclosing, when you make the fact that they're not disclosing confidential, you're no longer transparent. Unless I'm missing something. But again, just taking a step back, and I think that's what I find so interesting. With this, the way you report this, which and again, we were saying during the break, why aren't the Republicans jumping on this? Mm-hmm.
Because they love to hate the UN, and these are actual real issues. But again, what I find interesting is as you were saying, that taking Yemen as an example, the geopolitical situation there is deteriorating. At such a pace, and nobody even knows where Yemen is on a map, let alone that the Saudis are basically running. This horrible war. You've got the Houthis and the former president Saleh in the north. Then you've got the Saudis controlling the south. I was just reading this morning, the new plan is, we'll just partition the country, and the Saudis will rule the south. And if Saleh and the Houthis want to join, that's great, but they can, run the north as this, it'll be like Somaliland or something. No one will recognize it, and we'll bomb them later. But when you have that kind of a situation going on, where no one is even remotely aware of what's going on, then, the corruption of the Yemen envoy, who gives a shit? Let this guy do whatever he wants. Because
exactly. I think you found the sweet spot, right. And I think it also, in terms of the partisan politics in the U.S., people are so suspicious of Iran that it's like, who cares? So the guy's pro-Saudi, no problem. There are a few. Just in the last couple of weeks, you have like Rand Paul is trying to stop the sale of tanks to Saudi Arabia. Probably there's a California rep who's a Democrat. There's the guy from Connecticut. There's a few, but it's true. It's a little bit quirky because if you just look at it superficially, you say, well, Iran, we're against Iran. The Republicans are against the Iran deal. So how are they going to be against a pro-Saudi envoy? You know what I mean? It's sort of like, so the UN can get away with anything when they find these like gray zones of geopolitics. I can't stop it, but shout out to Somaliland. Only today, I asked the UK ambassador about a petition that's from Somaliland in which 1 million people, and again, it has its own freedom problems in Somaliland, I guarantee you, but 1 million of 4 million people signed a petition seeking to be recognized as independent, saying that they've been free of Somalia from 1991 and they don't want to go back. But it's again one of these issues. The UK ambassador nodded and said, I'll get back to you, which hasn't happened yet. But this is one of the reasons that I still like coming into the UN, because as bad and as unresponsive as the Secretariat is, if you cover the Security Council, an issue that's not even on the agenda, you can at least I put the video up, people wrote to me. I think they're expecting the UK to come out with a statement, which I don't think they're going to. I think it's like they're the pen holder. In the Security Council, every agenda item has like a country that, drafts the documents. And for Somalia, it's the UK. And I think they're basically constantly telling Somaliland, buckle down and get with the program, take a little bit of autonomy. Apparently, they don't want to do it. It's a big world. Since you mentioned them, I go weeks at a time without hearing about those guys. So.
Oh well, no. Somaliland is just one of those. It's one of those funny ones too, where it as you said, it's got its own problems. But I guarantee you, anybody in Somalia would much rather live in Somaliland. Totally. You're talking about way more. Just freedom of movement. People go to school. There's actually an economy. The only thing they're lacking really is recognition by the international community. I think there's like a few countries, but with no real weight that recognize Somaliland.
And again, this is the kind of bureaucratic way in which the UN can even undermine things like that. Like one of the issues I worked on that was their airspace, right? You have these areas like you were mentioning is a kind of like it's a Mad Max situation, but ultimately, as Somalia has said, whether gotten back on its feet, they've been given back control of their airspace, right? Of course, America can fly drones anytime they want, but the basic, you couldn't fly a 747 into Mogadishu without telling the government. But for the longest, or for some time, Somaliland was controlling its own airspace, and suddenly, by the flick of a bureaucratic pen at the UN Development Program, of all places, they awarded Somaliland's airspace to Somalia, which gave rise to a lot of pushback, and they hadn't thought it through. So then Somaliland said you can't fly in, aid the UN Humanitarian Air Service. It gave rise to like 2 weeks of me I'm trying to ask, and they're saying there really is no problem, and then there's a leaked memo, and then they say, okay, there's a problem, but it's like they didn't, so presumably they have like a Horn of Africa desk, and then this is for what it's worth. These days, they had a Law of the Sea meeting in the basement of the UN. You go down there's the representative of Somalia complaining in a very well put together speech with most people, falling asleep about South Korean trawlers engaged in illegal bottom fishing off the coast of Somalia. So it's like, it happened. It was said. So I come up and I say, what's Ban Ki-moon's position on this? Oh, don't know anything about it. Ask the South Korean ambassador. Oh, June. Don't know anything about it. And it's like, so you have these like little factoids, these little phantom pieces of information, and it's true. Like, I mean, it may be true that like there were pirates from Somalia, but it also is true that people were dumping toxic waste and illegally fishing. And so
they destroyed one of the only sources of actual viable income in Somalia. When it became just an open secret that you could go there to dump waste, destroying the fishing industry, and then of course all those fishermen did become pirates. I mean, yeah, of course, I think there was always piracy.
I know, exactly. I feel a little funny saying like, and those guys, all they want to do is fish, No. Yeah, there's going to be when you have big tankers out there, you're going to have a lot of different motives. But I think it is true, and it's sort of like that's the fun. Like the UN is just, in a way, it's almost like it's just parallel worlds. You have like, and the people giving the speeches sometimes don't even care. I mean, newsflash, people giving speeches don't care about them. But like sometimes, even despite that, there's some nuggets in there. Today there's a debate. The thing I was having to juggle around is a debate about the weapons of mass destruction. You have like countries reading out these by rote speeches talking about 3D printing and the dark web. I'm not sure that they really know what they're talking about, but there it is. And it's like, okay, let me ask. I don't know if the UN can deal with the dark web if they can't even like have an actually functioning recycling garbage can. Like it all goes together. Like there's one bag. It took me a while to explain. They're like, what do you mean? There's 3 holes. I'm like, yeah, there's 3 holes, but like take off the cap. One bag. It's like,
right. Oh, we'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
But exactly. Going back a little bit, Matthew, I just wanted to kind of get your take on this, and then I think we'll try and just talk a little bit about good old Ban Ki-moon. But back with Ladsous and the running the UN peacekeeping again through France. It seems that again, and I just want to kind of drive that point home, is that when they control peacekeeping, I mean, especially when it comes to Africa.
Yep.
I mean, they can essentially, again, it's people a lot of times I think talk about, UN as a colonial force, which they are. But I think you got to take a step back and really look at, look at who runs on the Security Council. You get someone like France. They run the peacekeeping. They're able to control all of these African countries all over again. And they, and again, just to kind of, and they allow for whatever to go. I think they more or less, they're cool with the rapes and murders and things like that because it keeps all these countries destabilized. That can be the story. It's a bunch of bad Burundians in Central African Republic. Not that, France is using the peacekeepers as a facade to, buy up mining rights in some of these places to, facilitate the flow of drugs and other things. So I don't know, anything just quickly on that. Because
totally. I mean, I think it's an open sea. It's surprising to me that people don't, there was a Security Council trip to West Africa, and, the U.S. was put in charge of the Liberia leg, and the U.K. was put in charge of Sierra Leone, a former colony, and France was given Ivory Coast. I mean, it really is and recently on Burundi, like, even though they've been doing a bad job, France has the pen. So they, and there are many, I know I get a lot, every day I'm sent stuff by, I guess you could call them anti-government Burundians or Burundian civil society concerned about an illegal third term. And they, France is not on their side, but France has the pen. So it's like France kind of, eventually there was enough sort of like low grade, all of the NGOs are saying, possible genocide, and Samantha Power is talking about it. So France passed a resolution to send 228 police, but hasn't taken a single step to actually do it. You know what I mean? It's like, and here's back to Labs, this is getting a little more sinister. The allegation very much, and it's not, I don't think just an allegation, in the 94 Rwanda genocide is that France was on the side of the genocidaire, Hutu government. And all I can say is Ladsous, the current head of UN peacekeeping, was France's deputy ambassador in 94. And by hook and by crook, I got a copy of an internal memo that he wrote back to Paris while he was deputy ambassador in the Security Council, saying, I've convinced my colleagues to, delay deployment until basically the genocidaires escape into what was then Zaire and is now Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's like, so I asked him about that. And I said, like, given your history, given your like documented written history in the Great Lakes region, like, how can you assure that you're going to be even-handed? And his answer was, I don't speak to you, sir. I don't respond to you, sir. You know?
Yeah.
Like he literally, like one time I was filming him and he raised a file folder. So it's that, and you could, the fact that you could get away with it, the fact that you could get Ban Ki-moon, Ban Ki-moon's previous spokesman was a guy called Martin Nazirki, and he would at least, I think he tried to not get sucked into Ladsous' madness. So he would call on me, I would ask my question, and Ladsous would say, sir, I don't answer you, you know, and then I'd sputter and they'd move on to somebody else. The current guy, Stefan Dujarric, just doesn't call, goes out of his way, no, be quiet. And the irony is, again, not to toot my horn, but day to day, more than half of the questions about peacekeeping, I'm answering them. So it seems strange that you bring in the head of peacekeeping. You're like, sorry, I don't see you. Anyone? And the question will be things that are not even, there's not even a peacekeeping mission in the country. You know, and he'll say, well, very important. So it's just, but it's true. There is, Niger and uranium. Yeah, there's a whole, and there was talk in France that somehow they were moving away from this France-Afrique concept, but I don't see it. And I think they're now using, counter-terrorism or even in the Central African Republic, there's a kind of it has a religious dimension to the fight. So they're able to now use this as a rationale for getting back into places, and they go in and they don't leave. They're not leaving.
Yeah. Oh, and as you said, then they're buying up uranium, they're buying up gold. There's a thriving cocaine trade that I'm sure they're looking the other way on. As something that you've reported on the mysterious, 40 pounds of cocaine that ended up in the mailroom?
The UN mailroom, that's right. They claimed that it was just somehow misdelivered, which seems hard to believe because this is the perfect place to do it. It seems like probably just one bag was found out of many because the mail, it doesn't get searched, right? It comes in here and people can just, the one beauty of these diplomats is that they're immune. They can't be searched. They drive in, you drive out, you got the blue license plate, and there it was. Somebody in security one day called me and said, you've got to get over here. So I get over there. There it is. 26 kilos of cocaine in the UN mailroom. So I wrote the story, and then I asked at the briefing, and they looked askance, and then they called a press conference, a stakeout, media stakeout at 6 p.m. to have the head of UN security then, come and give his spin and say, we're looking at it, but we're not sure we're really the target. This may have just been a wider ring in which we were just a very small part. And again, without trying for once not to name names, Wire Services wrote the story up. No credit. They made it as if the UN itself had voluntarily disclosed that they've been victimized, but it's just, that's kind of, and again, that's really the least of it, but it is, that was something.
Oh, and just quickly on that, didn't they also at one point the UN said that they gave the coke back?
Yes.
The person that it belonged to?
Look, in the Ng Lap Seng case, no one can explain where the money's gone either. They're they even put in their audit that a UN official, even when confronted, refused to give back the free iPad, saying, I don't have to, I'm with the Global Compact, it's not really a part of the UN. It's pretty amazing. Actually, again, even though I think that it's just kind of the best known right now UN misdeed, but the science has been clear for 4 years that the UN brought cholera to Haiti. That by negligence, peacekeepers from Nepal were deployed to a base in Haiti with bad sanitation. Their excrement went in the river. 10,000 people died, and the UN throughout it has maintained that they're immune. They haven't accepted court papers. Ban Ki-moon hid from the process server. They don't even go to court. The U.S. administration has been in court arguing for the immunity of the UN. But again, it gets even worse because nothing has actually changed. I want to the degree that your listeners have heard that Ban Ki-moon has changed his tune. He hasn't changed a single thing. They got an internal report saying, it's becoming harder to deny we were involved. But it's an internal report from a, quote, special rapporteur who's not, they always point out, these guys are independent, they're not with the UN. It's just that this time, Ban Ki-moon's deputy spokesman decided to say, this is a useful report. And so it was sort of, I think, over-reported. UN admits its role in cholera in Haiti, and it hasn't admitted anything. It certainly hasn't paid a penny to the victims. And I think maybe this is where we'll take it, is that it's basically an attempt to, this is one of the many, I think, but one of the main stains on Ban Ki-moon's tenure at the UN. And there's a desire to, without actually changing anything, create the impression that something has changed and that it's not as bad as it looks, and they've turned the corner. And there'll probably be very little follow through because they need, it's not rocket science. Like, if a company had killed 10,000 people, taking responsibility means paying compensation. It's not that money brings people back, but when you don't pay a penny, you're not taking responsibility.
Oh,
right?
Especially also you're talking about a country like Haiti. I mean, people barely clinging on to
absolutely.
life. And again, this is after the earthquake.
Yeah, it's not a windfall for them either. Many people, the way I always say is I use this word breadwinner, which is kind of archaic, but if the breadwinner of the family is killed by cholera, it's not like they have free schools. Kids will come out of school, people lose their homes. That's why it's one of the clearest cases where, you have to pay compensation. And in fact, this amount of delay, even if you were to pay it now, you've screwed these people for kids don't go to school for 4 years. And it's just the idea that it's the UN, which goes around the world preaching accountability and transitional justice, and they can't even in the most basic, you did this, and all they can do is hide from it and say, literally, I know the people that were bringing the cases, and they're they tried to get Ban Ki-moon served the papers when he went to the Asia Society, and he literally, first he took it thinking it was some well-wisher, he could sign an autograph or something. Once he saw what it was, he dropped it on the ground, classic mafia style, literally, and it's so then I go and I say, is it true? Did you, throw the paper on the ground? I mean, the lawyers in that case couldn't get their faxes acknowledged. Did you receive it?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. The same thing, and once I was thrown out, some various, freebie lawyers from Geneva and stuff, said they would write to the UN. They're we can't even get them to answer the phone. And their defense wasn't we have a right. There's no due process. They basically just said there's no right to be a journalist at the UN, and that's it. We're calling it quits. We can do it on any grounds we want. We could say openly, we don't like your story about Ban Ki-moon and Ng Lap Seng. You're out. You're on the street. And we're gonna. I have to say this. The office from which I've been working, and which sort of just gave me a pass that I could go through the turnstiles, has been given to an Egyptian state media called Akbar Al-Yum, whose correspondent, Sana Youssef, never came to the UN, have never seen her. And there's supposedly a rule, you have to come 3 days a week, never asked a question. I asked the spokesman, has this person ever asked a question? He said, well, I don't take attendance. and the person's a former president of the group that you mentioned, UN Correspondents Association. So it's literally just censorship, basically awarding, this is what we want to reward. Don't come, don't ask anything, here you go, Be asking questions. Yep. We're gonna grill you. I've had guards surround me and say, "You gotta leave the building now." I'm I've got the rule book. I can stay until 7 p.m. They're no, get out.
Yeah, no, it's nutty. I was just thinking too with Haiti and the cholera thing. That's the last thing the UN ever wants to do is just give people money after a disaster. They love to bring in food and as aid to places like Haiti, but they would never give them money, which would then, what would happen? Well, then they would be, patriotic.
They have free day, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Right. No, they never want to do that. They want to have all these people dependent on UN food, which is half the time it's rotten or it's old. There's never enough around.
There's a peanut issue in Haiti where even the U.S. was trying to dump some surplus peanuts, and actually they said we don't want it. It's going to destroy our economy. But that's another.
Right. Yeah, no, that's another podcast, radio show we could do. But quickly, as we're getting up towards the end, is just to kind of talk about Ban Ki-moon. We were talking during the break just about his sort of persona, because I think that's also why he gets away with this, is he's seen as this very kind of quiet, soft-spoken, when he does get
there. I think he's very popular. I mean, actually the main thing I to be able to say it, and I've been covering this as well, much to my detriment. He wants to be president of South Korea. He believes he can do it. The election is in December 2017. He's leaving here January 1, 2017. In May, he went on a trip to South Korea for 6 days, had a partially off-the-record meeting with political journalists, I've talked to a number of them who've called me because they're like, what's going on with this? He said things like, I'm not too old. Look at the age of Trump and Clinton. I'm ready. And it's like, the reality is just like, despite corruption scandals, despite anything, I don't know if it'll work for him because right now he's kind of a blank slate. He's been away a long time. No one, he's never really been a political figure there to have to like have a debate. Like, what would you do with North Korea? But so he's kind of an empty vessel that people can think of. But I think it's the part for me that's troubling is that I think a lot of the UN energy is being used kind of to one, try to make the illusion of problems being solved that have remained, like Haiti cholera. Like they're much more concerned with how it's reported than actually changing their position. Same thing on this. There's a thing with Yemen where he took Saudi Arabia off a UN blacklist for having killed children. Now it makes him look bad. His officials meet with compliant journalists who say Ban Ki-moon might change his mind, and people are so desperate for a story, and he's so little known that you can write a story like Ban Ki-moon it threatens to get tough with the Saudis, and there's no, it's a week later and he hasn't done it. So was the story true or was it just spin? And I have to say that, and it might seem, self-serving, but I honestly think that the ton of bricks that fell on me for just beginning to look into the way in which the Ng Lap Seng scandal, but other UN for sale under his tenure lead to him, resulted in boom, you're out. And now they kind of don't know what to do because from my point of view, and it's like the only answer to attempted censorship is to redouble your efforts, right? Like if you end up reporting on it less, then they got what they wanted. But this is constantly, it's getting to the point where they're like, well, people say to me just stop asking those questions and probably you'll the Egyptian will mysteriously disappear and it'll be back in. But it's like, it can't be that way. Like it can't. You just have to, my idea is you have to just keep, following the questions where they lead, even if where they lead to is out onto First Avenue, apparently.
Yeah. Well, and also just to point out, the UN is super corrupt, and there are serious issues going on there. But if you don't kind of actually get into the nitty gritty of it, it's very easy for people. Ban the UN and blah blah blah, this and that. But if you're not actually looking into this, and if you're not actually following up on, like you said, some of these, there's some aspects of this corruption scandal where, Ban Ki-moon must have been getting bags of cash. We can only assume.
Personally, I think this is this idea, like I mentioned to you earlier on, that this longtime mentor, he's described in the South Korean press as a advisor for Ban Ki-moon to run for president. This guy Han Sang-soo. It's not just like, here's a favor, we bend the UN's ethical rules or ignore them so you can make some money. Like, maybe this is going to end up being helpful to the campaign. I think, and I don't think it's that far out to say that. It's the kind of thing that in U.S. politics, people, not just journals of opinion, newspapers would pursue that story. But you do it here and it's like people are aghast. Like, how could you? That's our Secretary General raising a champagne glass. I've been in briefings where journalists for major American TV broadcast networks, I don't know if they really are, so they say, will say things like, what are we going to do about X? And again, I'm not anti-UN, but we're journalists, right? It's not like we're like this kind of enterprise of the good guys, that we know which countries are good and which are bad, and let's go in there, and it's like, it's too much, and I think that the UN benefits from that, from this kind of. And if you don't get into the nitty gritty, you're left with just a kind of a vague dispute from people who believe in multilateralism and those that don't. Those isolationists and those.
Well, we're at the break. Matthew, quickly, where can people go to read your stuff?
Sure, innercitypress.com. That would be the thing. Innercitypress.com, @InnerCityPress on Twitter. Hopefully a forthcoming Banning the Press book. Go look for it.
Excellent. And we will definitely be having you back on. But anyway, thank you all so much for listening. And I won't be talking to you next week, but I will be the following week after that.
Okay. See ya.
and information you can trust. This is American Freedom Radio. Freedom. American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.